full extent of his crimes as yet unknown. From the dock, he'd shown no emotion. He stared straight ahead as the foreman of the jury read out the verdicts. Guilty to 15 counts of murder and to forging the will of one of his victims. These are wicked, wicked crimes, Mr. Justice Forbes told him. Each victim was your patient. You murdered each and every one by a calculated and cold-blooded perversion of your medical skills. These are the women Shipman murdered. Not one was suffering from any serious illness. Everyone died suddenly after a visit from Dr. Shipman. There is little doubt, said the judge, each victim smiled and thanked you as she submitted to your deadly ministrations. You brought them death disguised as the attentiveness of a good doctor. His victims' families were in court. Many wept quietly as the verdicts were read out. Afterwards, the daughter of his last victim, the woman who finally raised the alarm, spoke of her family's loss.
Sadly, nothing that's happened here, nor can happen in the future, can bring about my mum and all the other victims. We hope we can now have the space and the time to remember my mum as she was, a happy, active, caring, energetic, loving person whom we miss so much.
The deaths of 136 of Dr. Shipman's patients have been investigated by police. Further murder charges are possible.
No decision can be taken as to whether it is in the public interest to pursue these allegations further until the views of the families concerned have been sought.
Shipman's wife Primrose and his sons Christopher and David were also in court. Their solicitor issued a statement on their behalf.
Mrs. Shipman is devastated by the verdict that has been reached today. The last 18 months have been an ordeal for her and her family. I would ask you now, please, on behalf of Mrs. Shipman and her family, to respect their privacy at this time.
After he'd sentenced Shipman and sent him down to spend the rest of his life in custody, the judge took off his wig and, with his own voice, straining with emotion, he paid tribute to the courage and the quiet dignity of the families of Shipman's victims. Finally, he thanked the jury for their service in what he called this deeply disturbing trial, the significance of which could not be overstated. Many questions remain. Harold Shipman left his trial showing no remorse and offering no clue as to why he became a mass killer. A prosecution lawyer said it was simply because he enjoyed it. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, Preston.
Our crime correspondent Stephen Cape has followed the case since Dr. Shipman was arrested back in September 1998. He's been in court throughout the trial and reports now on the extraordinary story of the respected local GP who turned to murder on an unprecedented scale.
18 months ago, in this incident room, up to 50 detectives started an inquiry which became Britain's biggest murder investigation. They looked at over 100 suspicious deaths. And in these files, they amassed evidence against one man, a family GP. Now Dr. Harold Shipman is regarded in modern times as the most prolific convicted serial killer in Britain.
I'm sure you've had enough time to take a decent photograph.
It was greed which was his final undoing. Kathleen Grundy was the last victim. Shipman arrived at her home on the pretext of carrying out a blood test, but injected her with a massive dose of morphine. He then made an amateurish job of forging the will, leaving her substantial estate to the GP. It said, "I want to reward him for all the care he's given to me and the people of Hyde." Shipman then faked the signatures of Kathleen Grundy and 2 witnesses. It was her daughter, a solicitor turned amateur detective, who exposed Shipman. She was a key prosecution witness in the trial, alerting the police when she became suspicious.
We began to think that Dr. Shipman had killed my mother, but it was very, very difficult to believe, and we kept going over and over it and thinking round and round it and thinking, well, it must be Dr. Shipman, but it can't be.
The authorities started the delicate job of exhuming bodies. First Kathleen Grundy in 1998, others followed throughout that year. Scientific tests showed they died from morphine poisoning. Shipman was interviewed by detectives. Sessions were recorded. They reveal he attempted to lie his way out of trouble, even suggesting a victim had abused drugs.
I had my suspicions that she was actually abusing a narcotic of some sort. But The scenario was there, and she did have drugs available. She may well have given herself accidentally an overdose.
Often Shipman responded with one-word answers, but the police persisted.
Into a house, rolled the sleeve up, administered morphine, killed her. That's what happened, isn't it, Doctor?
No.
In interviews, he broke down, but police suspect it was a sham.
My assessment of him, that he was treating this as some sort of game, a competition, pitting what he considered to be superior intellect to those of the officers who were interviewing.
Captured on home video, 77-year-old Lizzie Adams, a dance teacher until she was murdered by Dr. Shipman. The GP was able to kill his victims because they trusted him. The police said Shipman covered his tracks by falsifying death certificates, creating bogus medical records, and callously misleading relatives.
The only thing I can think of is an evil man. He's just evil. He's bad through and through.
So how many people did Shipman kill over the years? Some speculate it's more than 1,000, but the local coroner thinks there's a more realistic but equally chilling figure.
One has to look at the number of cases that the police actually investigated, the 136. I suppose there are some people who have still not come forward, whose relatives have died. Perhaps one ought to look at a total of 150.
There are some who are still hoping to discover the truth. This man's mother was a patient of Dr. Shipman who died in suspicious circumstances.
It's rather like a circle. There's no beginning and no end. Was she murdered, or did she die of natural causes? And that is far harder to cope with than actually knowing one way or the other.
Some of Shipman's victims are buried at the local cemetery, but there will be little peace for the relatives. Detectives continue to investigate 23 more suspicious deaths. Stephen Cape, BBC News, Hyde.
What's now emerging is that there were many warnings about the Shipman practice, and the police stand accused of responding slowly to the growing evidence from doctors who worked with him and even from local undertakers. Our social affairs editor, Neil Dixon, reports on the monitoring of family doctors and what went so wrong in this case.
We trust our doctors, we rely on them, we put our lives in their hands. At this surgery, Dr. Shipman betrayed that trust, and for years he got away with it. The organisations that might have protected his patients failed to do so. It was in Halifax in 1976 that the first clue emerged that all was not well. Shipman appeared in court after his partners discovered his drug habit. He'd been forging prescriptions and stealing the medicine. Dr. Shipman was convicted of 8 charges of obtaining drugs by forgery and deception, precisely the method he was to use to obtain morphine to kill. His case also came to the General Medical Council, which is supposed to protect patients from bad doctors. But the council took no disciplinary action, and Shipman was left to carry on practicing.
Those involved must have thought at the time that it was the correct decision. Whether it's a decision we would take today is rather different.
It was to be more than 20 years later, when Dr. Shipman had set up his own surgery in Hyde, that further warnings emerged. Across the road at this neighbouring practice in 1998, they became suspicious. The GPs here were concerned at the number of cremation forms they were being asked to countersign. The death rate among Dr. Shipman's patients appeared to be 10 times greater than among their own.
We were absolutely staggered. We couldn't explain this at all. This, in addition to the undertaker's observations, that they too were attending far more of Dr. Shipman's death than any other doctor in Hyde.
Greater Manchester Police were asked by the coroner to investigate without alerting Dr. Shipman. During this first inquiry, officers did not interview all the doctors at the Brook surgery, or Shipman, or relatives of the dead. Indeed, the BBC has established that the most basic checks were never made. Most amazing of all, the officers did not check whether Shipman had a criminal record. They did not check his General Medical Council records. They did not even investigate all the deaths that were causing concern. The inquiry left Shipman free to carry on killing. Senior officers admit a check on criminal records should have been made, but insist that otherwise their officers did what they could at the time.
We will clearly be reviewing all of the matters in relation to this after this inquiry, and any lessons that can be learned will be learned. But we are dealing with a historically unique set of circumstances.
Relatives of those who died after the first investigation believe the police failed in their duty.
When you're talking about people dying unnecessarily, I think the police should have rigorously investigated it and more thoroughly than what they did.
And relatives will also want to know why Dr. Shipman's activities were not picked up by the local health authority. He had a conviction for dishonestly obtaining drugs. The health authority knew nothing about it. 5 patients actually died in his surgery. The health authority knew nothing about it. And during the mid-90s, 85 more of his elderly women patients died than would have been expected. The health authority knew nothing about it. Tonight at a news conference in Preston, health authority managers admitted that monitoring systems throughout the NHS were inadequate. They also announced that one of their medical advisors, who'd assisted the police in the first inquiry, had been suspended. But they insisted that did not mean either he or the authority had done anything wrong.
The health authority is not set up to monitor, to find murderers. We're set up to monitor general practice, and the health authority has done everything within the fullest extent of its powers.
More could have been done to protect the patients who came here. Warnings went unheeded, and it's clear that the whole system for checking up on GPs is inadequate, not just here but everywhere. There will now be a government inquiry. It's certain to lead to tighter controls on the medical profession. Neil Dixon, BBC News, Hyde in Greater Manchester.
Earlier on this evening, we spoke to Dr. Raj Patel, a GP who worked in Hyde and dealt with Dr. Shipman. He was one of the first people to fear that something was terribly wrong.
We were first aroused in early 1998. It was really around the fact that all of my team, the 5 doctors, had all noticed that we were doing more cremation forms on behalf of Dr. Shipman than it seemed normal for that time of year, even though it had been a bitter winter. The turning point was a couple of weeks after this. The undertakers, the masses, mentioned to one of my team, Dr. Susan Booth, that they were concerned that they were attending far more deaths of Dr. Shipman than any other doctor in Hyde. They were also concerned that Dr. Shipman had been to see the patient frequently on the day of death. They were also concerned that the manner in which they found the patient was unusual, in that the patient wasn't found lying in bed in the night clothes. The patient wasn't found collapsed, fully clothed. The patients were frequently found fully dressed, but resting in their chairs with no signs of injury and certainly no contributory signs of illness around them in the form of drugs or anything like that.
Dr. Raj Patel, time now for the headlines. The time approaching midnight. The Manchester GP Harold Shipman has been convicted of killing 15 of his patients and of forging the will of one of them. Britain's worst serial killer will spend the rest of his life in jail. Relatives of the victims have welcomed the verdict, but have called for lessons to be learnt from the case. The Crown Prosecution Service is reviewing a further 23 cases, and the authorities believe there could be more than 100 other victims.